Okay,
Off we go.
great. Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here. I'm very interested in talking about trauma to anybody who will listen to me for any length of time. I'm a therapist and a consultant and a trainer. I've been working up and down the country, largely in schools, but also in social care, secure units, residential children's homes, CAMS teams, inpatient services, anybody who will listen to me talk about why trauma-informed practice is kind of the name to what we know is the right thing to do for our young people. Now, I haven't got control of my clicker, so I have to do that thing and say, next slide, please, which I'm beginning to wonder in and of itself might be a trauma when I keep thinking about watching the pandemic updates and having to listen to next slide, please, and notice that immediately had a little reaction in me. I've only got a short time to do what I often do in a day. So what we're going to try and do is just think about a sort of shared definition of what do we mean when we're talking about trauma, and then think about how that relates to the pandemic. What might it mean if we were running a trauma-informed school or a trauma-informed service? And then to think about if we use trauma-informed as our lens for supporting children and young people, what might we do? Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm a bit of a trauma geek. I have a lot of people that I'm interested in who talk about trauma. And this is one of my favorite definitions. This is the work of Gabor Mate. Trauma is not what happens to you. It is what happens inside of you because of what happens to you. And this means it can have a very unique flavor. The kinds of things that impact me, even when I'm standing next to you, may be very different. You know, and I'd give the example of, imagine, you know, you and I were driving to work one day and then you're on your phone, maybe you're swiping left or swiping right or catching Pokemon or whatever it is you do on your phone in the morning. And a car pulls out in front of us. And immediately my survival response turns on. And I steer away from the car. And I'm like, phew, and there's a reaction left in my body. And in fact, when I pull up to that junction tomorrow, I go, I might say things like, it's a rubbish junction, that one. I'm going to drive the other way. I might talk about it a lot. But you looked up from your phone and said, what's the problem? And you said, well, the car. But you didn't see it. And if you didn't see it, it didn't happen inside of you. Next, please. We can't really talk about trauma without talking about the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who was very much behind getting PTSD recognised as a diagnosis in the first place, and has since driven the drive to recognise the trauma that is experienced in early childhood as a drip, drip, drip for children who've had to live with a lot of adversity. I mean, when we were first looking at trauma, and it's quite astounding to know that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, wasn't even recognised as a diagnosis till the 80s. And in the 80s, we were talking about white men going to war. We weren't talking about the impact on the nervous systems of women experiencing violence, of children experiencing abuse. And we certainly weren't anywhere near thinking about the impact of racialised traumas on generations of young people. So probably this is another quote that I like that really kind of gets the essence of what we're talking about. It's not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is that imprint left by that experience of mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. So when we're thinking about, and we're vectoring our thoughts about the pandemic at the moment, our question really is, what is the imprint that this has left on this child, or this community, or this family? how is that imprint going to change the way in which they see the world, relate to other people, or make sense of how they move through the world? Next, please. So how can we sort of, distill down what we mean by trauma? And I think perhaps not perhaps a capsule, but a helpful way of thinking about it is when the survival response gets turned on and it's not processed. So it hangs around. So the survival response changes how we react to the world. And a traumatic experience is one that we tend to keep on reliving. It's a real problem for people with trauma to be present in the moment, because we're always reacting to something that happened in the past, reacting to the now or reminders in the now as if it's the past. So perception is way more important than reality. And this is really important for teachers, because very often what teachers will say is there was no trigger. There's no trigger for it. It was a disproportionate reaction. I didn't see it. This child is completely safe in my classroom, and they're acting as if their life's at risk. That's because their survival brain perceived some kind of danger. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so look, I'm going to do this tiny little bit of brain science, and I think this is really quite helpful, particularly for teachers, because it kind of shows how we're on the same side. I have a lot of compassion for teachers who have to adjust to one new way of doing things, another kind of philosophy, a restructuring of this, and there's lots and lots going on. And I want to be very clear that trauma-informed schools is not just about kind of being nice and mental health. It's also about improving academic performance, entertainment, because I know that's another pressure that our schools are experiencing. So if I did the tiniest little bit of brain science, and I'm not a brain scientist, so I do know it's not red, orange, and yellow. I know that much. But let's think about it in this way. So one way of thinking about the human brain is that we have a brain that is built in layers, a triune brain, a 3-layered brain. At the very bottom, and I'm going to use my hand, this is Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, some of you may know. At the very bottom of the brain here is the reptilian brain. It performs the 27 different functions that a reptile's brain can. And they're all to do with, just keeping going. They're to do with breathing and lungs doing lung stuff, digestion doing digestion stuff. And one day I'll find out what the spleen does, but it keeps the spleen doing the spleen stuff as well. Kind of just keeps us moving around. It doesn't think. It just is. On the top of that is a part of the brain, sometimes called the limbic system, also sometimes called the mammalian brain. And this part of the brain is much more connected with emotionality and are we safe? Mammals, I've got nothing against lizards, but they're not great parents. They lay eggs and then they slither, scurry, whatever else. And if you see two snakes together, they're kind of just in the same place at the same time. They're not mates or on a date or anything, because they don't have those kinds of connections. But by the time we get to mammals, we're taking care of our young. We live in groups, we connect to survive. It's an imperative to find a way of connecting to survive. And then on the top of the brain is the neocortex. This is the thinking part of the brain. And in the thinking part of the brain, this is where we can reflect on what's going on, we can plan, we can organize, we can inhibit response. And this is the part of the brain that we need to learn anything, not only how to do relationships, but also how to do GCSE in geography, or holding pencils, or your timetables. So what we need is our children with access to their thinking brain. But what happens with these two downstairs parts of the brain, the limbic brain and the reptilian brain, is that these are our survival centers. And if something happens and we perceive a danger, this part of the brain goes off like a fire alarm. And when it does, the thinking brain is offline. So the reason that's so important for thinking about schools and thinking about children, is that if something happens that triggers their survival brain, they are not available to learn, and neither can they hear you. So this is for those children who are in the state and you're talking to them about, if this happens, you won't be able to think about how somebody else is. You may have to be in detention, da, 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 da. We are using our thinking brains to connect with a thinking brain that is offline. So the goal of educators, or one of the many goals of educators, and the goals of those of us thinking about trauma-informed world are the same. We want as many of our children and teachers and parents in their thinking brain feeling safe and not being triggered. Then they can learn, then they can feel safe. Next, please. And there's a little reference here. There's a really nice a clip of somebody explaining the hand model of the brain. Oh, no, go ahead. That's fine. Almost fine. Okay, let's do that. We're ahead a bit now. Okay, so this is sometimes I get given 2 days to talk to schools. Sometimes I get given half an hour. If I'm given half an hour, this is the one video I choose to show, and this is the work of Jacob Ham, explaining really clearly why we all need children out of survival brain and into their learning brain. So if you could play that for us now, that'd be lovely.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. So this is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn, and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Next slide then, please. So, I mean, that's it, guys. You've all got to be elephants. They feel safe enough to be able to learn. And I put this in here because we're not just thinking about the brain. It's not just happening here and here. We know that when we feel unsafe, it's happening throughout the whole body. So our task in trauma-informed schools, there's lots more to it than this, but at the very, very bottom line, it's what do we do to make people feel safe? And coming back after the pandemic and after lockdown, well, not after the pandemic, but after lockdown, what do we need to do to make children feel safe? And I did a lot of work with both Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea and a few other schools around that time, really focusing on when we're coming back, how do we make people feel safe? Because if they're not safe, we can't get them back into the schools, we can't get them back into learning. And next, please. And again. Wonderful. So, a number, once, the pandemic struck, there were a number of sort of trauma theorists who put their mind to, how do we stop this becoming a trauma? How could the pandemic be seen as a trauma? And this is Bessel van der Kolk, and he talks about what makes something a traumatic experience rather than just an experience. And there's some common denominators, and you can see how these overlap on lockdown in particular. The lack of predictability. Human beings like predictability. When we don't get it, then we feel unsafe. Immobility. If you're not able to move, something's more likely to be traumatic. What does that mean? I mean, we worked with schools where children weren't leaving, a 5th floor, or in some cases a 24th floor flat for the entire time. Real sense of immobility. A loss of connection. Stephen Porges talks about a loss of connection. The loss of eye contact, the loss of neurosystem to nervous system to nervous system contact. Now, whenever I'm training, I'm a complete nightmare about asking people to put their cameras on. I sit alone in a room, a lot of us do. We need to see each other's eyes and connect as best we can. Numbing and spacing out is another thing that's likely to make it traumatic. Not being aware of what we're feeling. Alcohol consumption went up. Quite understandably, this is an awful situation. What's the best thing you can do? Let's drink, as did the use of illegal drugs as well. A sense that it will never end. I mean, if you're a child, how can you imagine when this lockdown will ever end, or when the restrictions will ever end? We just don't know. And there was a real loss of safety. There was an existential threat to health. It was out there. We were seeing people dying. It's still out there. But if you think about it, at the height of the pandemic, when those were all the images that were available for all of us, and people who are still losing loved ones to COVID-19, and a lack of a sense of purpose, when people lost their capacity to go out and work, or children's capacity to go out and learn, all of these things can be real precursors to an event becoming traumatic. Next, please. Many of you will be using the recovery curriculum, and which I think is a marvelous document. I took a little bit of exception to this particular sentence. Let's see where it goes. So 5 losses, brilliant. Routine, structure, friendship, opportunities, and freedom. Absolutely, all of those were losses for our children. They can trigger the emergence emotionally of anxiety, trauma, and bereavement in any child. Absolutely, of course they can. The overall impact cannot be understated. It will cause a rapid erosion of the mental health state of our children. Now, it's that last sentence that got my heckles up a wee bit. Will it? Just because something's happened doesn't mean to say it will become a trauma or rapidly erodes the mental health state of our children. Because we as adults can do something about that. We have the capacity to be the protective, buffering, mitigating containers that our children need. So the kind of sense that it is kind of inevitable, rather than actually people have been doing things all the way through and continue to do things all the way through. Children can live through awful, awful things and be okay enough if their adults are. Next, please. You know, of course, anxiety's gone up. Anxiety went up through a pandemic. I took this from the mind. It's natural to feel worried, sad, scared, angry, or annoyed about the coronavirus. Feel several emotions at once, or even just really confused. You know, anxiety is there for a purpose. Anxiety serves the purpose of keeping us safe, alerting us to danger. You know, kind of a little bit, I don't want it to sound too flippant, but a little, found myself shouting, if you're not anxious in the middle of a pandemic, you're not paying attention. Being anxious in the middle of a pandemic is an appropriate response. And you know what happened? When we got a little bit complacent about it and our anxiety went down, the government raised our anxiety. The level of pictures went up of intensive care beds, because what that did is it made people wash their hands and wear face masks and take the threat seriously. So when are we going to say that the anxiety you feel in the middle of a pandemic is a reasonable reaction to a really abnormal situation? Or when is it pathologized? So and that's a really big question. But what I don't want to do is just assume that feeling anxious during a pandemic is a mental health problem. It's an appropriate response to what's going on. Next, please. Resilience. Yes, good. So people talk about resilience. Kids are really resilient. Kinda. If you think about resilience in terms of materials, so you've got a squishy ball here. This is a resilient ball because you squish it and it bounces back into shape, as if it had never been squished. People don't work like that. When something happens to us, we change shape slightly. Maybe we don't feel completely squashed down, but we're never quite the same. It leaves an imprint on us. There's a lovely example in a fantastic book I'm reading at the moment that talks about, if you've ever undone a coat hanger to, get a set of keys out of a grill or unlock your car when you've locked yourself out, and they always use it cleaning out the Hoover, and you then try and put the coat hanger back, it doesn't go back into the shame stream. So children are only resilient when their communities are resilient. So actually the intervention that we may need to be doing is about communities, which is why I'm here to talk about trauma-informed schools. I'm hoping there will be money to support recovery for our children. But I think it would be a really crying shame if we spent that money seeing children on a one-to-one, often in a cupboard in a school somewhere, with great mental health professionals working through worksheets to support children who are feeling anxious, rather than spending that money to make their schools, their classrooms, the adults around them feel safe. In my trauma-informed utopia, every child, when they step over the doorway of their school, their nervous system will go down. I'm safe here, not up a notch. And there's some great studies to show that some kids did phenomenally well educationally during the pandemic, because for them, school was the place that provoked anxiety. And sitting at home with their carers or their parents, they were able to learn. We've only got two real drives as little people. One is to survive, and one is to learn. And if your entire energy is taken up with survival, not a great deal of space left for learning. So we want our schools to feel safe for all children and for all adults. Next, please. So trauma-informed is great. I went to school the other day and they were like, oh, she's here at the insert, another thing we have to sit through, another new set of policies and guidance. And it was lovely. Somebody at the end put their hand up and said, I'm so pleased you are here, because you weren't telling us about new things we had to do. You were confirming about how we had to be. And so many of us are already there, and I know that's true in schools. It's about how we see things. It's our values, it's our approaches. Next, please. So what is a trauma-informed school? Well, it's one that knows what it means to be a trauma-informed school. And there is no official guidelines. You know, there are people out there who will roughly come up with what trauma-informed looks like. But it really means a few things I'm going to talk about now. It means that the school is aware of trauma. We have a sort of thorough assessment. We look at inclusiveness, any specific factors, looking for senior leadership buy. We know that people will go, you know what, don't like this, we've already done it, it's not going to work. Aren't we just rewarding bad behaviour? There have to be consequences. I hear these things a lot. And those are really important voices. You know, always listen to those voices, they've got information for us. We have trauma-informed discipline policies. If you're interested in looking at that, have a look at either the City of York guidance on trauma-informed behaviour policy. There's some good work, attachment work coming out of Brighton Hove, and a couple of others. And of course, look, the bottom one should be first. The awareness of the prevalence and impact of secondary traumatic stress on teachers and staff. Next, please. Trauma-informed practice, let me put it in a nutshell. We look at the behaviours that we see in children as adaptations they needed to make to survive. Now, if I'm not talking the pandemic context, I'd be talking about how do they learn to survive their families and their communities. And we ask, how does it make sense given what has happened to them? And how do we and our reactions make sense given our own experience? Next, please. We ask, what need is being met by this behaviour? Or what danger, real or imagined danger, often imagined danger, is being avoided or safety sought? Next, please. We ask, what happened to you? Not what's wrong with you. How useful it is. Some diagnoses open doors. Conduct disorder, oppositional defiance disorder. The psychiatrists who used to say it's just great. Just say they're naughty. Doesn't get you anything else. Just says they say no and they can't conform to normal standards of behaviour. Next, please. How do they make sense? How do they learn to survive? Next, please. What do we, as the adults in this system, need to be the containing people that they need? What do we need so we can do this? And sometimes if I'm working in social work or foster care or families, we're asking this parents, what do you need so you can be that person? And then what do you need from adults? What does this young person need from adults so they can regulate and manage themselves? So that's the difference. Again, another school once said to me, oh my goodness, so we stop trying to manage their behaviour and start equipping them to manage their own behaviour, which is slightly different to some of the things that were happening in the Don't Exclude Me documentary. Next, please. We certainly don't see that our young people are manipulative or attention-seeking or destructive. All they're trying to do is cope. And they'll use any available resource. Running, hiding, fighting. They are not okay. Kids who are okay don't behave and don't present that challenging behaviour. They're letting us know they're not okay. Next, please. In a trauma-informed school, the adults are prepared to recognise and respond to children who've been impacted by trauma. And we include everyone. Everyone. Because if you as teachers are managing this, you know, you're responding and meeting needs and down-regulating and creating safe places. But the person on the front desk has already given them the detention and had to go at them for being late. Or your grounds manager shouts at them. Or the people in the canteen don't get it. So we do the whole community. Next, please. But it's not. I always say to people, look, it's not just liberal hippie stuff. You know, I am a liberal hippie. Let's not pretend that. But actually, we're talking about neuroscience. We're talking about neuroscience and effective response. So it's not that kids get to do whatever they want to do. We keep our standards. We keep our rules, we keep our boundaries, but rather than punishing kids who can't do it or rewarding the kids who find it easy to do it, we work out what do they need from us to meet the standards as high as we want to keep them. So we're just doing something slightly different. So we give them the tools to cope. And we teach them, if you're struggling with this, how can we help you? Next, please. And this is a lovely quote from the Trauma-Informed Schools US. There is a Trauma-Informed School UK, which has got some great stuff on it. I think there's some, I like the stuff that's in the US also. I love this. An important shift in trauma-informed schools is that instead of labelling and engaging in battle with non-performing and non-compliant students, questions are asked regarding possible reasons for explaining the student's behaviour. This results in a school that understands and recognises that a student's behaviour is shaped by their former life experiences. It drives a response for addressing in a positive and affirming manner the student's needs and change. A trauma-informed school is ready to address students, to show through their behaviour their needs for support. But how are all students supported, regardless of their trauma history? If a school that is trauma-informed provides a safe, sane, secure and caring climate, it can and will ultimately address the needs of all students. Next, please. So I've got this down as sort of 3 jobs. And this really is a whistle-stop tour. There's so much more I'd like to say. But if we were going to support children through the pandemic, using a trauma-informed lens, these would be the things we do. The first thing we do is support the adults to be the people our student need us to be. Because, as Bessel van der Kolk says, the single most important issue for traumatised people is to find a sense of safety in their own bodies. We're going to help them feel safe. Next, please. So safety, just a quick word about safety. Safety also lives in the nervous system. So if you look at, take the pandemic for an example, and take a school who's done a lot of things to show you how you're going to be safe. This is where our classroom is, this is where I wash our hands, this is our one-way system, you are safe. But safety lives inside. So I think if I was in this cage, even if you told me that shark had no teeth, that this was the strongest metal that ever existed, and I had 10 years worth of oxygen, my nervous system would tell you whether I was feeling safe or not. So we need to ask people, we need to watch people, they will tell us with their behaviour. We need to ask them, what do you need to feel more safe? And teach them to notice when that's going on in their bodies. Next, please. And building it in layer. If the school staff don't feel safe, for whatever reasons, pandemic or the area you're living in, or the culture of the school or whatever, then nobody else can feel safe. And coming back after lockdown, we're really emphasising that first of all, the staff had to say, we're safe with this, we're okay. Because then the parents and carers would feel safe enough to give us back their children. And if the parents and carers feel safe enough to send their children to school, the children will know it's okay. Next slide, please. And I wanted to talk about this neuroception. So that's like, I put a dog there because I was thinking about smelling fear. And I was thinking about, Stephen Porges's work, polyvagal theory. Our nervous systems talk to each other, and you cannot blag it. Many of you teachers will know that on the day that you are having a rubbish day because of stuff in your own life, it felt like they went for you. Supply teachers, really, you have my heart. You walk in there and they go for you very often. Our newly qualified teachers. And no matter how much you lag it with your nice smile and your friendliness, if your nervous system is going, get me out of here, the kids know. They don't look at each other and go, ha-ha, let's go for it. They just feel unsafe and they start to go for it. The kids that don't separate because mum's going, it's all right, darling, you can go to the nice people. And, every part of mum's body is going, don't go. So we have to feel safe first because we can't blag it. So what do staff need to feel safe? How can we increase felt safety in staff? Next, please. And your next job is to think, what did lockdown mean to this child? How was it different to another child? We had some families who had fled terror from their own countries. None of them would leave their flats. It completely triggered the time in which they had to hide to survive for months at a time. There's a complete traumatization. What difference does it make if your parents are masked up and washing their fruit and vegetables or are claiming that it's a hoax? What's it like if when you go to school, you're putting your grandmother's health at risk? What was it like for this child? So we have to be really curious. And for generations to come, I think, in child and adolescent mental health assessments, we will be saying, what was your child like before the pandemic? How did it change? What was the cultural stories that were told? Did they feel better and safer at home and coming back to school was actually the trauma? So curiosity. How does what they're doing now make sense? What need might be being met or what danger avoided? Next slide, please. Same storm, different road. What was it like for you this time? Ask questions, be curious. Next, please. And the last job is to respond effectively. If you identify through attunement that this child is feeling frightened or scared, then the response is to make them feel safe. If you think this child is manifesting their need for care or attention, then you give it to them. You think this child hasn't got the skills that are necessary to inhibit response or communicate effectively, then we teach them. An effective response for a frightened or scared child who's enacting their fear through challenging behaviour are not detentions or minus house points or reward schemes. And again, not because it's not nice to do it, because it's ineffective. If you're frightened or scared, name your reward or punishment. If you had a tiger in your room with you now, what reward could I give you that would keep you sat on your chair? What punishment could I give you that would keep you sat on your chair? If the survival brain is triggered, none of your house points, reward schemes, or detentions are going to work. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. And I suppose it is because I have a little bit of concern that what we're going to do is identify the 12 most traumatized children in the school and give them CBT in a cupboard. I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist, amongst other things. I'm not anti it. But actually, we then make this child a problem. You have a problem. You're anxious. You didn't manage the pandemic very well. Rather than how do we change our schools into places where children's nervous systems turn off as they step over the classroom door. I have one last thing to say, and I'm aware of the time. The other thing that is fundamentally essential is that we address racism in schools, is that we have active anti-racist policies. Because one of the things that makes children of colour feel repeatedly unsafe in school is the systemic racism in the school system and in the staff that are there. If we really want children to feel safe in school, we want them to feel safe in their skin, whatever colour their skin is, in their school. Last slide, please. This is one of my favourite quotes. This is my favourite quote. This is Gabor Mate. Safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. One job, connect and make them feel safe. With however, and so many, you will know exactly how to do that. Last slide, please. Or maybe that is my last slide.
And that is your last slide.
Ah, good. I sometimes have a question slide. Okay,
I've got one of our own just here for us to just.
Super. Okay, I'll take a pause while Phil takes over for a moment. Is that the right system?
We'll be doing questions first before that. Is it? But I'm more than happy to give you a second. Just have a drink.
No, I don't need it. No, I can go for hours, me.
Oh, that's no problem in that case. So the way that we'll do this is we'll start by I'm going to ask a couple of questions, just general ones to get the ball rolling. Then we'll take the questions that have already been presented in the chat, and then we'll take any other questions orally that anyone else would like to present, who's on the line with us as well. So just to start off, and really actually it came up right at the end there, sort of about race and so forth in schools. So in my teaching practice, I specialize with traveller children originally, and then with children coming out of North Korea at the end of it. Do you feel that sort of as teachers, with where we work in environments where we might have particular social economic groups or even ethnic groups, that getting to know those communities can really help us deal with what you refer to as their triggers? So understanding the children would allow us to understand the triggers.
Understanding, I mean, I wouldn't want to do any of that work without really understanding the cultural meanings of it.
Yeah.
And acknowledging, always acknowledge that I have one lens. I'm a middle-class white woman. I see things through those eyes, so I will miss things. And it's possible that even my very being or the way I do things could be triggering. And asking, what is, we react to things that feel like they might be traumatic from us. We hear about them from the traveling community, for example. But actually, this is the cultural norm, and that's something we need to know. What would be distressing, what wouldn't be distressing, and how does a family see? One of the things that's happened in many cultures is we've lost the ways in which we naturally absorb trauma, and a lot of our cultures already still have that. We've been separated from it. How do you normally manage when something difficult goes on? What do you do? Who do you talk to? What are the way in which your community processes trauma?
And definitely, I just secondly, I'm probably leading really on from that. I'm sure some of the people on here would have seen a particularly difficult clip in a recent BBC documentary on exclusions, where a child was being questioned after an event that had happened in a classroom by a member of senior leadership. During that scene, it seemed as if that particular member of staff at that time was in a position of stress and probably anger with the student themselves. I just thinking, what sort of steps as adults and teachers could we take to kind of just step back and make sure that we're approaching children for their best interest and not as an overall, not from a personal standpoint, and stand off with a child, because the last thing anyone should be doing is standing off with an 8-year-old.
No, don't get me started on that documentary. And I was really heartbroken when I saw somebody say, "Oh, this is trauma-informed practice at its best," and it is not. There are some very tiny bits of things that could even begin to be considered curiosity. So we have to regulate ourselves. I train in something called the ARC framework, attachment, regulation, and competency, and we have a kind of a mantra that we say, which is observe, modulate, do. And it goes, the first thing you need to observe is what's going on for this kid, ideally over time, so you can get in front before it escalates. The next person you need to observe is yourself. Have I got my feet on the ground? Do I know what is my stuff? Can I breathe? So observe, then modulate yourself. Calm yourself down. Then you can modulate the child in front of you. Bruce Perry says a regulated adult can calm a dysregulated child. A dysregulated adult can never calm anyone. And then the last part is do when everyone is calm. Strike when the iron is cold. If you just remember that very simple hand model of the brain, if you've got something you want to teach a child or an issue you need to explore, you need their thinking brain back online. So we need to go back when it's calm, go, hey, you remember that thing that happened? So that sort of, aren't you just letting them get away with it? No, we're waiting for them to be calm. And then we can have a meaningful conversation. And a big thing really in our training is to spend a lot of time working with teachers not to take it personally. It's so hard not to take it personally. But if you can understand trauma, you maybe begin not to. And one of my trauma-informed schools, they have it on the back of the toilet doors, staff toilet doors. Are you taking it personally? Or can you remember it's this kid's trauma?
And then I suppose next along that line is just sort of, so there are a lot of groups obviously that advocate the use of controlling activities for the controlling of stress in children, sort of mind up initiatives and so forth. Would you recommend those activities as things that can help inform in a trauma informed school?
Absolutely, and the but is we need to make people feel safe. So, I absolutely love the use of mindfulness in school. But if you just go through mindfulness as an exercise, when actually there are kids who are terrified about sitting in the school hall or too frightened, you can go through all of it and nothing ever lands. So if you're going to do that, how do you create safety first? Because teaching mindfulness is teaching a skill. So again, we need some part of the thinking brain online so you can learn it. So, you can't learn to do mindfulness if you're dangled over a pit of sharks. And if your school hall or classroom is a pit of sharks, you can't learn maths or mindfulness.
Perfect. And I'm just going to move on then to a question that's been presented by, there's a few actually now. Let me scroll up and we'll get to the first question and then start moving down. So from Magella, I'm very interested in Katie's sensible comments about treating one child when really we should be working on ourselves and everybody. How do you change this mindset?
Slowly. So how do you change this mindset? Well, I think, like Nigella, there are a lot of people that when I say it out loud say, yes, I know. That kind of makes common sense to me. Of course it makes common sense to me. Sometimes we say we do it one classroom at a time or one teacher at a time. So this is what I do. We go and we talk about it, we explain what we're trying to do and why it makes sense. And most people go, yeah, that does make sense. We want our schools to be places that are calm, where everybody feels safe. So it is about, if I was working with the school, we'd look at everything. We'd look at, the gate, the music that people are playing when they come through. What happens if you change the lighting to lighting that doesn't? You go to some schools and we've got lots and lots of really quite complexly traumatized children. And every 40 minutes you go at them and then wonder why the corridors are chaos. So, there are some environmental things to do. There are some really good examples. Unfortunately, a lot of the videos available are from the States. Well, not unfortunately. I've got schools in the UK that we're working on them. There's a school called Fall, F-A-L-L, Hamilton. And if you look for that in YouTube, you'll see their work. So just have a look at what they're doing. But I'd agree. We don't want to keep making this child the problem, which was exactly what was happening. What I wanted to do in Don't Exclude Me was go and change that whole school because there were some fantastic teachers working really, really hard in there, but they were just othering children with challenging behaviour rather than making the classroom a safe place. Chantal, it's Fall, F-A-L. Thank you. Brilliant. So you put it in the chat. Great, thank you very much.
Okay, just next on from that is, so Chantella said, hi, as a school, we have a new trauma-informed behavior policy, and we have a good understanding of what is needed in a school and that children need to feel safe. We now would like some examples and techniques on supporting individual children. How might you suggest building connections in a classroom environment with limited adults and not leaving the classrooms? So keeping it within the classroom, what techniques could we use?
Okay, so a couple of things. One, I often say, if you're lucky to have like a child wellbeing practitioner, or you get a CAMS worker or whatever, if you get them to do the assessment rather than the work. So what you would hope is child A in your class who struggles, in the same way that when you go into some staff rooms, you've got, this child's allergic to peanuts, this child can only hear you in one ear, are more challenging pupils. We don't need it for everyone. We have a list of down regulation activities, so we would know what they need. But we would also want the teachers to have an eye on the energy level of the classroom, and then to implement some down regulation activities. Down regulation whenever the energy gets too high, rather than fighting against it. And those could be things like, I've already said, having music playing, low level music, stopping the class to do breathing exercises, just normalize it. At the beginning of every class, we breathe. We breathe out geography and breathe in French. We're here in our chair, we're here to do this. This is how our bodies work. Another nice example is when we're doing this work, getting kids to rate their energy levels. And you can do that by taking a register, by calling people's names out, and they say high, medium, low. So then you've taken the temperature of a class. So I really heard that piece without leaving the classroom. Part of me says that the kids still need to leave the classroom at times. And again, I think unfortunately, this is where the Don't Exclude Me school got it wrong, because they had their nurture area, which was the same as their exclusion zone, which really kind of makes a mockery of having a nurture area if it's also where kids go when they're bad. But in those nurture areas, we want to change it. We want to get kids out of the classroom when they start to dysregulate. And they get out and they go and see somebody for 5 to 10 minutes who does the down regulation with the goal of getting them back into the classroom, equipped with coping strategies as quickly as possible. So it's like popping off to first aid and coming back again before you completely escalate it. And we change the meaning of it from you're being sent out because your behaviour is bad to you need to go somewhere for additional support. Just for a minute, just go and see them. And you'll have 2 minutes worth of breathing and come back. And without additional resources, the schools I know are using this are repurposing their exclusion or isolation rooms. So you've still got the same room, the same staff managing it, they're just getting in front of the behaviour and getting kids back in as quickly as possible. So we haven't changed the staffing levels, we haven't changed the physical, we're just using it differently. Because you want to get a kid out before they've lost it.
Okay, just moving on to one that's quite similar, but we may have some more points to add on it from you, Casey, from Claire. I hear many head teachers who want to empower their teaching staff to use a therapeutic response to their pupils, but when faced with a class of 30 and several have flight or fight responses, they are having difficulty simply having the manpower to provide the one-to-one therapeutic connection when desperately needed. So they then use old behavioural moderation techniques as at a loss how to manage the rest of the class at the same time. And it's probably something I can definitely relate to in situations.
I can absolutely relate to that. I mean, there's only one of you and a lot of needs. In some of the schools I work with, there's an awful lot of need. So again, it's those small gains. What can we do to lower the emotional temperature? I think of Steve Peters, who was behind the British cycling team, who took one gain at the moment, 2% up by giving cyclists their own bedding, 3% up by feeding them the food they like. We might be able to go 1% down by not having bells, 2% down by changing the lighting. And this makes the point beautifully. So if we're going to spend the money, and if there is any money, if the money that is promised from the government comes, then actually what you're better off doing is having another teaching assistant in the classroom rather than a therapist seeing one child every half hour. Let's support our teachers to do it rather than take that task out of their hands and do something less helpful.
Perfect. And I believe that is everything from the chat. So unless anyone wanted to ask any questions in person, I'll give a second now for anyone to turn off their mic, turn on their mic, sorry, if they'd like to.
Joseph just asked another question, which is, do you feel that positive behaviour-based interventions are helpful? I'm going to give the same answer as to the question about mindfulness. These are all fantastic skills, but we have to have somebody who can hear you. So even the positive-based psychology, which is wonderful, needs to be received by somebody who's not frightened. So you can go through all these programs with kids. They can have loads and loads of CBT, loads and loads of positive-based, loads and loads of mindfulness. You can throw it at them, but you're throwing it at a survival system who can't hear you. And the same goes for parents and parenting classes. You can put parents through one parenting class after another. If they sit there feeling frightened and triggered, they can't take the information in. All of these tools that you've got are fantastic. What we need to do is create a place where they can be heard, because our children's nervous systems are relaxed enough to learn.
And I've just realised we have reached 5 o'clock. So if anyone does need to leave, don't worry, we will be recording this and sending it round. So you won't be missing anything if you do have any other commitments you have outside of this in order for you to have to leave. So just one last question for me before we hand over to Penelope and Phil to talk about the mental wellness card game. I'd just ask, I suppose, to sort of close down on this, Katie, is what would be the biggest misconceptions that if you could sort of say, you tell someone this isn't trauma informed care, what would those be?
It would be that we let kids get away with anything. We're just kind of all floopy and 60s and kids can do whatever they like. And secondly, if we don't tackle their behaviour, they won't do well in the world outside. And I know what it is. The other one is, when we do something different from one kid, it's unfair on the others. That's another one. It's unfair on the others. And my lived experience of this is actually, it's the adults who mind. If kids are getting what they need, they generally just get on with it. You know, and when I say that, I say, if somebody says to me, you can't let one kid have a fidget spinner or a bit of putty because they'll all want them. And I say, I think everybody's got glasses, should take them off, because we can't have people wearing glasses because everybody's going to want them. Take your hearing aid off, all the other kids are going to want one. If we start recognizing that this is what this child needs to learn, it starts becoming a tool for learning rather than some kind of special gift that one child has.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. So they're there as a health aid in the same way that glasses or a hearing aid are. It's just about a more maybe mental health reason behind it than it is one of physical disability, which is obviously something we have large problems recognizing in society at the moment. From that, I'm just going to move on, and we'll let Phil and Penelope take over. We're talking about Book of BCs for the next 10 or so minutes.
Thank you very much, Asheen. That was absolutely brilliant. I think 45 minutes, an hour. But you've done a brilliant job in doing so, and it's absolutely fascinating. One thing that actually stuck out to me was, you said same storm, different boat, which I've heard before, and I think that captures the pandemic like amazingly, as that is kind of some of the most recent examples of shared trauma that there's been, that we're all going through, you know, a similar thing but experiencing it in a very, very different way. And I think that that's representative of mental health as well. You know, we all experience mental health, but we all experience it in different ways, as we do mental ill health, which is something that Book of Beasties kind of takes on board and tries to cater to, I suppose. So what we wanted to do today, excuse me, is introduce you to the mental wellness card game, which is our primary resource for schools, our primary solution for schools. But before I do, I'll introduce you all to Book of Beasties as a concept. Next slide, please, Asheen. So Book of Beasties is a developer of mental health and wellbeing resources and games for schools and parents that encourage children to talk about their emotions and their well-being. In a nutshell, Book of Beasties is used by just over 300 schools around the UK now, as well as other organisations, and we use the concept of play and creativity to raise emotional literacy and encourage the open conversation about mental health. Over to you, Penelope. You're muted, Penelope.
We've all done this one.
I do apologize. Sorry. Sorry, I'm going to talk now about the sites and the partners. So we work with a number of different organizations that we launched in 2018, and with our key partners being Greenwich Almost Street Children's Hospital Charity and the University of West London as our research partner. We recently conducted a virtual kids workshop with Barnardo's charity, which protects, supports, and nurtures the UK's most vulnerable children, in which we address mental health and well-being issues that were topical for the current time, with the emergence from the lockdown and return to school. We have also worked across sectors other than education, including social care, healthcare, and counselling, and working with a number of local authorities. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Oh, there you go. Thanks. So onto our main resource, which is the mental wellness card game. So as I said, this as all of our resources do, uses the concept of play, creativity, and storytelling to raise a child's emotional literacy, to build resilience, and teach empathy, and explore the topic of mental health and well-being in a really child-friendly manner, whilst introducing really simple solutions that the children can practice should any issues arise. So all of our resources are psychologist endorsed, and the mental wellness card game is university accredited to a pilot study level. To give you an idea about the game itself, you've got that pinky purpley squid-like creature that's on the screen there. Her name is Pupulo. She's a bright fluffy cloud. She's really creative, she's really intelligent, but every now and then she gets a foggy brain and she can't focus on anything at all, and this makes her feel really incapable and small, and just kind of generally damages her self-esteem. Now, to help her, we have to use a particular item. So every character has a solution that we can help them with. And to help Pupulo, you need to use the bellows, which you can see on the green card there, which in real life is something that you'd use to blow on a fire and build up the flames. But what that translates to is deep breathing. So we practice the deep breaths with children. But to make that a more child-friendly approach and a bit more fun, rather than just a breathing exercise, because it's not something that a child would necessarily end on if they have a foggy brain. They're not going to immediately think about deep breathing. We introduce activities, or really fun activities. So every character has their own dedicated activity, which represents a well-being solution. And for Pupulo, it's paper boat races. So we create an origami paper boat, and we use our deep breaths to blow it across the surface. And that helps them end up in that solution. So they would think, oh, I've got a foggy brain. And immediately we personified that by giving it a name. So they would go, oh, Pupulo. And then the next step is, oh, Pupulo, yes, the paper boat races. And that would then naturally bring them to the conclusion of the deep breathing exercises. Next slide, please. So to make Book of Beasties, the mental wellness card game, as impactful and useful to schools as possible, we put together a complete guide, which is a complete walk through the resource, but it also contains some really simple PSHE sessions or lessons, which provide structure to the game itself and introduce all the different characters, of which there are an array of different beasties representing different issues or concerns. And introducing activities and discussion prompts. We've also introduced some really simple assessments, such as the mood chart that you can see on the screen there. And the mood chart, we have the children fill out at the beginning and at the end of every session. And the teachers, or the facilitator, can keep track of a child's mood over a period of time. So it provides really in-depth, well, not really in-depth, but really useful longitudinal tracking of that child's well-being that can be really useful. Next slide, please. Okay, so this our social emotional learning solution. So this is what I'm going to give all participants access to, or we are going to give all participants access to for a couple of months trial. So you can explore all of our social emotional learning materials on our website. So we launched our website as in response to the pandemic and the lockdown. So the schools and parents can access our mental wellness resources digitally. We have an array of different resources and worksheets and art projects on our website that's all based on an ongoing narrative using that story as the kind of driver of the mental wellness topics that we cover. Next slide, please. Over to you, Penelope.
Now I mute myself. So we began working with the University of West London in 2019, and when they conducted a pilot study on the effectiveness of the mental wellness card game. The study looked at the impact of the game and lessons on pupils' awareness of mental wellness and well-being solutions, as well as the need for such a resource in schools. And the researchers found that children's socio-emotional skills improved, and the book of business was a valid and required resource for schools. One of the parents and of one of the participants said that she hoped the study will improve her son's emotional intelligence and understanding of others. When the study ended, her and her husband were not prepared for the dramatic transformation they saw in their son. Next, please.
Thank you very much. So yes, Bedia, just as a response to your question, this resource that you can see on the screen here, the remote wellness kit, along with all of our other resources, are primarily for the primary school kind of age range from key stage 2 to early key stage 3. So it kind of tips over into secondary schools as well. And many schools use it with the younger years as well. Our remote wellness kit here, which you can download from the website once I've given you all access, allows you to deliver the concept of the mental wellness card game, looking at the characters and the activities and the discussions without actually having to play the game. So it can be done remotely, hence the name. And it provides more of a whole school approach. So it can be used with a whole class rather than just a small group of card game players. And this was released in response to the last lockdown, so when the schools closed for the last time at the beginning of the year, and is being used by a couple of thousand teachers and parents now, which is awesome. And you guys will get your hands on that when I have set you up. So thank you very much. That is Book of Beasties.
So now we'd just be giving you an opportunity to answer any final questions that you may have. Just to clear up just around there, we mentioned that Book of Beasties is undergoing a pilot study, and obviously we recognize that validation is a big part of any of these sort of interventions being brought into schools. A complete validation of the product is currently underway. It was delayed by COVID, but it will be completed by the end of this term, and results are looking very positive so far. And I doesn't. Oh. How many players can play at one time? So in one game, it would be 6 players would be the optimum amount of players to play at one time. Do correct me if I'm wrong at any point, Phil. But it can be played down to between a parent and an adult themselves. You can, of course, as well have multiple groups set up playing games within a classroom for it to then expand out to a whole classroom activity. This would take some lessons to sort of get pupils used to how the game works and so forth. And that's all part of our school guide that comes with the game itself.
That's spot on, yeah.
There is another question from Sarah. It says that, yeah, I'm sorry for Bedia.
Oh, that's already been answered by Phil. So the resources are for Key Stage 2 pupils and pupils undergoing transition. So your early Key Stage 3 pupils as well. particularly useful for those transition pupils, or what we would call late transitions at the moment, our year 8 pupils, to get them talking about emotions, and also opening up with the other pupils in their class as they get to know those around them. Perfect. So it sounds like we've covered everything there. I'm just going to move on to our lovely thank you slide. So a big thank you to Katie for joining us today and for providing her insight on trauma-based care. I would also like to thank Phil and Penelope for showing us all the value of the mental wellness card game, and of course all of you for taking the time to join us, listen, and add your insights and questions to the forum. There was a particularly interesting talk there after Katie's presentation. As mentioned before, if you do have any further questions you would like us to consider, do contact the team via Penelope, whose contact details are shared currently on screen for you. If you have any questions specific for Katie, just mark them as such and we will be happy to pass them forward on your behalf. I hope this event has been helpful and insightful to all of you. I hope you have a lovely Tuesday evening, and best of luck as we move towards half term on behalf of all of us at Book of Beasties. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Joseph, if you want, I can just answer this question, and you can send in an email and I can send you, but yes, it's been used with autism and really well, by the way, really good. We have a specific beastie, which works really nice with children with autism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was absolutely brilliant.
Good. I'm glad. I hope it was
I love
helpful.
it.
Yeah, that
That
was
was
amazing.
fantastic.
Thank you very much,
I
Katie.
really
for
like
that.
it. It was amazing.
Oh,
Really good.
Oh, thank you very much. And please
I
feel
better
to
turn
share
off
my
our recording. Not recorders saying thank you to all of each other.
Yeah,
Well,
no swearing.